Someone get this vagrant away from my competition. The words cut across the morning air like a rifle crack, silencing the murmur of spectators gathered along the observation platform at Camp Pendleton. Major General Roland Whitmore stood with his hands clasped behind his immaculate dress uniform, his silver hair catching the California sun as he gestured toward the perimeter fence where two security officers flanked an elderly man carrying a battered rifle case. The old man did not resist. He stood with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, his faded utility jacket patched at the elbows with strips of silver tape, his boots worn through at the soles so badly that the rubber had separated from the leather. His face was weathered like cracked desert earth, white stubble covering hollow cheeks, and his pale blue eyes watched the approaching general with the patience of someone who had long ago learned to wait. Around the observation platform, the annual inter-service precision rifle competition had drawn nearly 300 spectators. Families of competing Marines filled temporary grandstands. Vendors sold tactical gear from canvas tents. Camera crews documented the event for official Marine Corps media. And now, every single one of them had turned to watch the confrontation unfolding at the edge of the parking area. General Whitmore descended the platform steps with the theatrical grace of a man who understood that power was as much performance as position. His entourage followed, a collection of staff officers and Pentagon liaisons who laughed on cue whenever the general made a joke and nodded gravely whenever he made a point. "This is a closed military event," the general announced loudly enough for the nearest spectators to hear. His voice carried the particular brand of contempt reserved for those he considered beneath notice. "We do not allow the homeless to wander on active ranges simply because they found a rifle case in a dumpster somewhere." The old man said nothing. His eyes moved briefly to the rifle case in his grip, a hard-sided container so scratched and dented it looked like it had survived multiple wars, and then back to the general. "Sir," one of the security officers began. He was found near the parking perimeter. "Says he just wants to watch the competition. We were about to escort him out when you arrived." "Watch," the general repeated, drawing out the word like it tasted sour. He turned to his entourage with a smile that invited them to share in the absurdity. "This man wants to watch precision rifle shooting. Look at him. Look at that case. What do you suppose is in there, gentlemen? A broomstick? A fishing rod held together with duct tape and dreams?" The entourage laughed. Several spectators in the grandstands shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, I want you to think about your own community for a moment. Think about the quiet people you pass on the street, the ones who seem invisible, the ones you might look right through without ever wondering what their story might be. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from today. And if stories about hidden heroes and second chances speak to you, consider subscribing to this channel so you never miss another one. Because what happened next at Camp Pendleton would become one of the most watched videos in Marine Corps history. The old man finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, rough from disuse. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir. I only wanted to see the young one shoot. I will leave if that is what you require." His words carried no bitterness, no sarcasm, nothing but a quiet deference that seemed to irritate the general more than defiance would have. "The young ones," Whitmore repeated. He stepped closer, examining the old man the way one might examine a stain on an expensive carpet. "You talk as if you know something about shooting, as if you have any business being within a mile of trained professionals." From somewhere behind the general, a voice called out, "Let him stay, sir. What harm can he do just watching?" Whitmore turned to identify the speaker, a young corporal with a video camera who quickly looked away. The general's eyes narrowed, then he smiled again, a cold expression that did not reach his eyes. "You know what?" he said slowly. "I have a better idea. Let the vagrant stay. Let him watch from right here, where everyone can see him. And later, perhaps we will even let him take a shot himself, just so he can understand exactly how far out of his depth he truly is." More laughter from the entourage. The old man simply nodded, his pale eyes revealing nothing. But what General Roland Whitmore did not know What none of the laughing officers or uncomfortable spectators, or even the security guards could have possibly understood in that moment, was that in exactly 4 hours, this vagrant in the torn jacket would step to the firing line and make a single shot that would end careers, launch investigations, and force the entire United States Marine Corps to confront an uncomfortable truth about how it treats its own legends. Because the battered case the old man clutched like a sacred relic did not contain a broomstick or a fishing rod. It contained a rifle named Patience. And the man holding it had not touched her in 30 years, not since the day his spotter died in his arms whispering words of absolution. He had promised himself he would never shoot again. But some promises were made to be broken. The general gestured for his entourage to follow him back to the VIP platform, already forgetting the old man as he turned his attention to more important matters of appearance and protocol. The security officers exchanged uncertain glances, then shrugged and returned to their posts, leaving the vagrant standing alone at the edge of the competition grounds. Somewhere in the hills beyond the range, wind flags shifted and danced in the morning thermals. The old man watched them without seeming to watch, his eyes tracking patterns that would have required instruments for anyone else to measure. His breathing had already begun to shift into a rhythm buried so deep in muscle memory that he barely noticed it anymore. For counts in. Hold. For counts out. On the firing line, the first competitors of the day were settling into their positions, their custom rifles worth more than cars, their spotting scopes and ballistic computers representing decades of technological advancement. They were the best the Marine Corps had to offer, young men and women who had trained their entire careers for moments like this. None of them glanced at the old man, standing motionless at the perimeter. None of them had any idea what was coming. 6 hours earlier, before the sun had crested the brown California hills, Elijah Kowalczyk opened his eyes in the back of a rusted van that had not moved under its own power in almost 2 years. The ceiling above him was stained with water damage, the fabric sagging in places where the metal roof had begun to corrode through. He lay on a foam mattress that smelled of mildew and age, covered by an olive-green Marine Corps blanket so faded that its original color was more memory than fact. For a long moment, he simply breathed, listening to the distant sound of trucks moving on the base access road, feeling the familiar ache in his right shoulder where shrapnel had torn through muscle and tendon 33 years ago. The van sat at the far edge of a gravel lot adjacent to the Camp Pendleton Range complex, a spot he had found 3 weeks earlier after drifting down the coast from Oregon. No one had bothered him here. No one had even seemed to notice him, which was exactly how Elijah preferred it. He had spent most of his adult life learning how to be invisible, and the skill had served him well in the decades since he stopped mattering to anyone. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and reached beneath the pile of blankets beside him. His fingers found the rifle case by touch alone, tracing the familiar scratches and dents the way another man might trace the face of a loved one. He pulled it onto his lap and simply held it for a moment, feeling its weight, remembering. "There's a competition today," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. His words were not directed at anyone visible. "The young ones will be shooting. I thought maybe I would walk over and watch them. Just watch. I will not bother anyone." He waited as if expecting a response, then nodded slightly at whatever answer he heard in the silence. "I know," he continued. "I know I said I was done. And I am. I just want to see if they still teach it the way we taught it. The way you taught me to see it." Elijah opened the case with the reverence of a priest opening a reliquary. Inside, nested in foam that had been custom cut decades ago, lay a rifle that most observers would have dismissed as junk. The stock was worn smooth in places and rough with neglect in others. The barrel showed spots of rust that seemed to bloom like orange lichen across the metal. The scope mounts were empty, waiting. But Elijah saw what others could not. He saw the custom action that a master gunsmith in Quantico had spent 4 months perfecting in 1971. He saw the barrel that had been hand-lapped to tolerances that modern machines still struggled to match. He saw the trigger that broke at exactly 2.3 pounds, not because of factory specifications, but because that was the weight his finger had learned to feel across 1,000 miles of impossible shots. He saw Patience, and Patience saw him. Beside the rifle, in a separate felt-lined compartment, lay a scope that had not been mounted since February of 1991. Elijah lifted it carefully, turning it in the dim light that filtered through the van's dirty windows. The glass was pristine, protected all these years by a man who could not bear to use it, but could not bear to let it go. Engraved on the side, in letters so small they were almost invisible, were the initials T.B. Thaddeus Birch, his spotter, his brother in everything but blood, the man who had lain beside him in hide sites from Vietnam to Kuwait, who had called wind and range with a precision that bordered on supernatural, who had pushed Elijah out of the blast radius on a February morning when their position was compromised and taken to shrapnel meant for both of them. Elijah could still hear the wet gurgle of Thaddeus trying to breathe with lungs full of blood, could still feel the weight of his friend's body going slack in his arms, could still hear the last words whispered against his ear before the light faded from those familiar eyes. "You still have shots to take, Eli. Take them for both of us." But Elijah had not taken any shots after that day. He had finished his service in a haze of grief and guilt, had collected his discharge papers and his medals and his commendations, and had walked away from everything that had ever defined him. The rifle went into its case. The scope went into its compartment. And Elijah Kowalczyk, the man they had called Spectre, the ghost who had made shots that should have been impossible, simply stopped existing. He drifted. Years became decades. Cities became highways, became forests, became coastlines. He worked when he had to, manual labor that required nothing of his mind. And he disappeared when he could, finding places where no one would look for him because no one was looking at all. The only constant was patience, carried with him always, never opened except in moments like this when the weight of memory became too heavy to bear alone. "I'm not going to shoot," Elijah told the scope in his hands. "I made you a promise. I kept it for 30 years, and I am not breaking it now. I just want to watch the young ones. I want to see if any of them have the gift. The way you had the gift." He placed the scope back in its compartment, but left the case open beside him as he prepared for the day. There was a public restroom near the range complex where he could wash his face and hands, where the lock on the third stall had been broken for months and no one had bothered to fix it. He had clean socks in a plastic bag, a luxury he rationed carefully. His boots were held together with determination more than material, but they would carry him the half-mile to the competition grounds. Before he closed the case, Elijah removed one more item from beneath the foam lining. A photograph laminated and worn at the edges, showing two young Marines in ghillie suits somewhere in a jungle that no longer existed on any official map. Their faces were painted with camouflage, but their smiles were unmistakable. One of them held a rifle identical to Patience. The other held a spotting scope and a notebook filled with calculations that would later revolutionize how the Marine Corps trained its long-range shooters. Brothers, before everything, before the shots that made legends, before the shot that ended one of them. Elijah pressed the photograph to his chest for a moment, then returned it to its hiding place and sealed the case. The sun was beginning to warm the van's metal walls as he stepped outside, the rifle case hanging from his shoulder by a strap that had been replaced so many times only the original buckle remained. In the distance, he could see vehicles arriving at the competition grounds, competitors and their families, and the inevitable parade of officers who attended such events more for visibility than appreciation. He did not belong there. He knew that. He belonged nowhere, had made peace with that truth long ago. But today, just for a few hours, he wanted to remember what it felt like to be part of something, even if only from the outside, even if no one would ever know he was there. He began walking toward the sound of the gathering crowd, each step carrying him closer to a reckoning that 30 years of hiding could not prevent. The security officers led Elijah to a holding area near the equipment tents, a patch of dusty ground shaded by a canvas awning where folding chairs had been arranged for personnel waiting between shifts. They did not offer him a chair. They did not offer him water. They simply pointed to a spot near the tent's edge and told him to stay there until someone decided what to do with him. Elijah stood where they indicated, the rifle case resting against his leg, and watched the competition unfold from a distance of perhaps 50 meters. The firing line stretched across the range like a surgical theater, each position occupied by a shooter and spotter team, surrounded by enough equipment to fill a small truck. Spotting scopes on heavy tripods, ballistic computers displaying calculations, wind meters mounted on telescoping poles, ammunition organized and precise rose like soldiers awaiting orders. The young ones had toys he could not have imagined in his day. They had technology that did the thinking for them, that measured and calculated and compensated for variables that Elijah had learned to read with nothing but his eyes and his instincts and the whispered guidance of a spotter who understood him better than he understood himself. He wondered if any of them knew what it felt like to make a shot with nothing but mathematics scratched on a scrap of paper and faith in a brother who would never let them miss. The first group of competitors he did not recognize arrived at the holding area to collect equipment from the supply tent. They were young, impossibly young to Elijah's eyes, their movements carrying the particular swagger of men who had never been truly tested. They wore custom shooting jackets with sponsor patches and carried rifles that gleamed like jewelry in the morning light. One of them noticed the old man, standing in the shade, and elbowed his companion. "Look at this," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "They are letting anyone onto the range these days." His companion, a lean Marine with tactical sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead, turned to examine Elijah with open contempt. The gaze lingered on the patched jacket, the ruined boots, the battered rifle case that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck for several miles. "What is in the case, old-timer?" the lean Marine asked. His voice carried the tone of someone who already knew the answer would be entertaining. "You find it in a pawn shop? Trade some food stamps for a piece of history?" Elijah said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the firing line in the distance, watching the competitor settle into position for a shot at the 800-meter target. "I asked you a question," the lean Marine pressed. He stepped closer, close enough that Elijah could smell the coffee on his breath and the gun oil on his hands. "You deaf as well as homeless?" The competitor on the firing line took his shot. Elijah watched the impact through the shimmer of heat rising from the ground, saw the strike land perhaps 2 inches left of center, and knew without being told that the shooter had failed to account for the thermal gradient building between the firing position and the target. The young ones trusted their instruments too much. They had forgotten how to see. "That is Staff Sergeant Declan Vance you are ignoring," the first Marine said. He sounded personally offended. 3-time champion of this competition. Best active-duty sniper in the Corps. You might want to show some respect. Elijah finally turned his pale eyes toward the lean Marine, toward this Declan Vance who stood before him expecting deference. He saw the confidence in a younger man's posture, the easy arrogance of someone who had never met his equal. He saw the custom rifle slung across Vance's back, worth more than Elijah had earned in the last 5 years combined. He saw all the things that Vance wanted him to see. And beneath it all, in the way Vance held his shoulders and the rhythm of his breathing and the unconscious positioning of his feet, Elijah saw something else. He saw genuine skill, raw talent that had been honed by training and competition until it gleamed like the rifle on his back. This young man was good, perhaps very good, but he was not great. Greatness required something that could not be taught, something that could only be forged in moments when the shot mattered more than survival, when the calculations had to be perfect not for a trophy, but for the lives depending on the outcome. Elijah had seen greatness. He had lived beside it for 11 years, had watched it die in his arms on a February morning that still haunted every hour of every day. This young champion had never seen anything of the kind. "I meant no disrespect," Elijah said quietly. His voice was soft, almost gentle, carrying none of the confrontation that Vance seemed to be seeking. "You shoot well. The 800-meter target. 2 inches left. The thermal gradient between positions 3 and 4 creates a drift that the wind meters do not measure. You'll want to account for that in later rounds." Vance stared at him. The arrogance in his expression flickered, replaced for just a moment by something that might have been confusion. Then the mask returned, harder than before. "You saw my shot from here," Vance said flatly. "From 50 meters away, through heat shimmer. And you're telling me I was 2 inches left because of thermal gradient." Elijah nodded once, a small movement that somehow conveyed neither pride nor challenge. Vance laughed, a sharp sound that drew the attention of others nearby. He turned to his companion with theatrical disbelief. "You hear this? The homeless man is giving me shooting advice. This is incredible." He turned back to Elijah, his eyes hard. "Open the case, old-timer. Show me what you've got in there. I want to see what kind of rifle a vagrant uses to give lessons to champions." Elijah hesitated. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the case strap, a movement so subtle that only someone trained to notice such things would have caught it. 50 meters away, standing near the range master's station, Master Gunnery Sergeant Nathaniel Okonkwo caught it. He had been watching the confrontation since it began, something about the old man's stillness triggering instincts he could not quite name. Now he watched those fingers tighten on the strap, watched the subtle shift in the old man's breathing, and felt the first cold whisper of recognition crawling up his spine. He had seen that stillness before. He had been taught by men who moved with that particular economy of motion, who breathed with that specific rhythm. Men who spoke in whispers about other men, legends whose names were never written down but never forgotten. Okonkwo took a step forward, then stopped. He wanted to see what was in the case. He needed to see it. "Open it," Vance demanded again. "Unless you are embarrassed. Unless that case is full of newspaper and delusion." Elijah looked at the young champion for a long moment. Then, slowly, with the reverence of a man unveiling something sacred, he knelt in the dust and laid the case flat before him. His fingers found the latches, and 50 meters away, Okonkwo held his breath. The latches clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden silence. Vance leaned forward, his companion craning to see over his shoulder, both of them already preparing their laughter for whatever pathetic relic lay inside. Elijah lifted the lid. For a moment, no one spoke. The rifle lay in its custom-cut foam like a body in a coffin, and that was exactly how Elijah had always thought of it. Patience was not a tool. She was a memorial, a reminder of everything he had been and everything he had lost. Vance's prepared mockery died somewhere in his throat. His eyes moved across the weapon with the involuntary assessment of someone who had spent his entire adult life studying rifles, and what he saw did not match what he had expected. The rust was there, yes, blooming across the barrel in patches of orange corrosion. The stock was worn and neglected, scratched and faded. But the proportions were wrong. The action was not standard military issue. The barrel was longer than regulation, thicker, with a profile that suggested hand machining rather than factory production. "What the hell is that?" Vance said slowly. The contempt in his voice had been replaced by something else, something he did not want to acknowledge. His companion reached toward the rifle, and Elijah's hand moved with a speed that made both young Marines step backward. The old man's fingers closed around the barrel with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the quickness of the motion, as if he were protecting something fragile rather than threatening anyone. "Please do not touch her," Elijah said quietly. "She does not like strangers." Vance recovered his composure, though it took visible effort. He crossed his arms and forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Her, you named your rusty museum piece. That is adorable, old-timer. Really touching." He gestured at the rifle with exaggerated dismissal. "That thing belongs in a display case, not a competition. I am surprised it does not fall apart when you pick it up." But Elijah was no longer listening. His eyes had drifted to the felt-lined compartment beside the rifle, to the scope that rested there like a sleeping child. The initials TB caught the light, and for a moment he was no longer standing in the dust of Camp Pendleton. He was lying in a hide site in the central highlands of Vietnam, 17 years old and terrified, listening to a voice beside him explain how to read the wind by watching the way grass moved at different distances. "You see how it bends at 200 meters but stays still at 400, the voice said. "That tells you there's a crosswind at the near range, but not the far. You have to calculate for both. The bullet will push left for the first half of flight, then straighten. Most shooters only account for the wind at the target. That is why most shooters miss. Thaddeus Birch had been 23 years old when he spoke those words. He had already completed 2 tours as a spotter, had already earned a reputation for reading conditions that others could not see. He had taken the young Elijah Kowalczyk under his wing, not because anyone ordered him to, but because he recognized something in the quiet boy from Wisconsin. A gift, a patience, a willingness to wait for the perfect moment that bordered on supernatural. They had become inseparable. For 11 years, they moved through jungles and deserts and mountains, through operations that would never be acknowledged and shots that would never be recorded. Elijah pulled the trigger, but Thaddeus was the one who made the impossible possible. He was the eyes, the calculator, the calm voice that turned chaos into clarity. When a Marine Corps decided to rewrite their Scout Sniper manual, they came to Thaddeus first. He spent 3 months translating his instincts into formulas, his observations into methodology. The appendix on extreme long-range calculation bore no author's name, but every instructor at Quantico knew who had written it. Every student who memorized those formulas was learning from a ghost. And when those formulas proved insufficient for the truly impossible shots, the shots that required something beyond mathematics, Thaddeus had developed new ones. He had scribbled them in notebooks that traveled with him everywhere, had tested them in conditions that should have made accuracy impossible, had refined them until they became extensions of his own intuition. Those notebooks had been in his pack when the explosion happened. They had burned along with everything else. But Elijah remembered. He remembered every formula, every variable, every whispered correction that had guided his finger on the trigger. Thaddeus lived in his memory the way Scripture lived in a priest, absolute and unalterable and sacred. Old-timer, Vance's voice cut through the reverie. I asked you a question. Where did you get that rifle? Elijah blinked, returning to the present. He looked at the young champion with eyes that had seen things no training exercise could simulate. And for just a moment, Vance felt something he had never felt on a firing line. He felt small. I built her, Elijah said simply. A long time ago, with help from a friend. Built her, Vance repeated. You expect me to believe you build a custom rifle. You, the homeless man who cannot afford boots that stay on his feet. Elijah did not respond. He was looking past Vance now, past the equipment tents and the firing line, toward the distant hills where the targets waited. And beyond them, barely visible through the heat shimmer, a glint of gold caught his eye. The 2-meal target, the trophy target, the one no competitor had ever hit. His fingers began to move against his thigh, an unconscious rhythm of calculations he had not performed in 30 years. Distance, temperature, humidity, Coriolis effect at that range. Bullet drop exceeding 400 inches. Wind at multiple altitudes. Thaddeus would have loved this challenge. He would have pulled out his notebook and started scribbling, his eyes bright with the particular joy he only showed when the mathematics became art. You still have shots to take, Eli. Take them for both of us. Elijah closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the calculations had stopped. He closed a rifle case with careful precision, latched it shut, and rose to his feet. She is just a rifle, he said to Vance. Old and tired. Like me. But 50 meters away, Master Gunnery Sergeant Okonkwo had seen the old man's eyes fix on the 2-meal target. He had seen the fingers moving in that unconscious rhythm, and the cold whisper on his spine had become a roar. He knew that rhythm. He had been taught that rhythm by instructors who learned it from a manual, who learned it from formulas, who learned it from Ghost. A ghost named Spectre. The morning stretched into early afternoon, and the competition continued with the mechanical precision of a military operation. Shooters cycled through their positions, targets fell and rose, scores accumulated on digital displays that updated in real time for the spectators in the grandstands. The crack of rifles echoed off the brown hills with rhythmic regularity, each shot representing years of training and thousands of dollars in equipment. Elijah remained where the security officers had left him, standing motionless in the shade of the equipment tent. He had not moved in nearly 2 hours. He had not asked for water or a chair or permission to leave. He simply stood and watched, his pale eyes tracking each competitor with an attention that would have been unsettling if anyone had bothered to notice. But no one noticed. That was the gift and the curse of invisibility. The young Marines moved around him as if he were a tent pole or a supply crate, an obstacle to navigate rather than a person to acknowledge. Staff Sergeant Vance had returned to his position on the firing line, where he was methodically building a score that would likely earn him his fourth consecutive championship. The general had retreated to the VIP platform, where he held court among his entourage and posed for photographs with the competition sponsors. Only Master Gunnery Sergeant Okonkwo continued to watch the old man from a distance. He had duties to perform as range master, shooters to coordinate, and safety protocols to enforce, but his attention kept drifting back to that motionless figure in the patched jacket. The rhythm he had observed earlier would not leave his mind. It was too specific, too precise, too familiar. Okonkwo had been a scout sniper for 16 years before transitioning to range operations. He had trained at Quantico under instructors who treated the craft like a religion, who spoke of legendary shooters the way historians spoke of Caesar and Alexander. And among those legends, one name was always whispered with particular reverence: Spectre. No one knew his real name. No one had photographs or service records that could be verified. The story said he had operated in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, in places that officially never saw American boots. The story said he had made shots that defied physics, that he could read wind and temperature and humidity through nothing but observation, that he had trained 3 generations of snipers who went on to become legends themselves. The stories also said he had disappeared. Sometime after the Gulf War, Spectre had simply ceased to exist. Some claimed he had died in a classified operation. Others said he had been recruited by an intelligence agency that valued his skills. A few believed he had simply walked away, unable to continue after losing something precious. Okonkwo had always assumed Spectre was a myth, a composite figure assembled from the achievements of multiple shooters, transformed through retelling into something superhuman. Instructors used his name to motivate students, to suggest that perfection was achievable if they only dedicated themselves completely. But watching the old man in the patched jacket, watching those fingers move in rhythms that matched formulas Okonkwo had memorized decades ago, he was no longer certain. On the VIP platform, General Whitmore raised a glass of chilled water and surveyed his domain with satisfaction. The competition was proceeding smoothly. The weather was cooperating. The photographers had captured several excellent images of him, presenting preliminary awards to distinguished competitors. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. His aide approached with a tablet displaying the afternoon schedule. "Sir, the long-range demonstration is set for 1,400 hours. Staff Sergeant Vance will be attempting to break the 500-meter accuracy record." "Excellent," Whitmore said. "Make sure the camera crews are in position. I want good angles when I present the commendation." The aide hesitated. "Sir, there's one other matter. The vagrant from this morning. He is still on the grounds. Security was not certain whether to remove him or allow him to stay as you suggested." Whitmore's eyes scanned the competition area until they found the old man standing near the equipment tent. A smile crossed his face, the cold expression of someone who had discovered an opportunity for entertainment. "Leave him," the general said. "I promised he could take a shot, did I not? Perhaps after Vance breaks the record, we will let our homeless friend demonstrate what a real amateur looks like. It will be educational for the younger Marines. Show them the difference between professionals and pretenders." The aide nodded and withdrew to relay the instructions. Whitmore returned his attention to the competition, already imagining the laughter that would follow when the vagrant inevitably embarrassed himself. He could not have known that his casual cruelty was setting in motion a sequence of events that would destroy his career, vindicate a legend, and remind the entire United States Marine Corps that some skills do not fade with age or circumstance. Near the equipment tent, Elijah felt the general's gaze pass over him and then move on. He was accustomed to being dismissed. It no longer bothered him the way it once had. What bothered him was the 2-meal target the gold silhouette that had been catching his eye all morning, calling to him like a siren. He had promised Thaddeus he would never shoot again. He had kept that promise for 30 years through every hardship and temptation. The rifle had remained in its case, the scope in its compartment, the skills locked away in a vault of grief and guilt. But the target was there, waiting, untouched by any competitor in the history of this event. Elijah's fingers began their unconscious rhythm again, calculating distances and variables he should not have been able to measure from where he stood. The mirage rising from the ground told him the temperature gradient. The movement of flags at various distances painted a three-dimensional picture of the wind. The angle of shadows revealed the sun's position relative to the target, suggesting how thermal currents would shift over the next hour. He saw it all without trying. He had never been able to stop seeing it. And somewhere in the vault of his memory, behind the locked door he had sworn never to open, Thaddeus Birch smiled and began to whisper numbers. At precisely 1,400 hours, the competition paused for the long-range demonstration. Staff Sergeant Declan Vance walked to the primary firing position with the confidence of a man who had never known failure, his custom rifle cradled in his arms like an extension of his own body. The crowd in the grandstands shifted forward in their seats. Camera crews adjusted their angles. General Whitmore descended from the VIP platform to stand near the firing line, ensuring he would be prominently visible when the record fell. The 500-meter target was a steel silhouette roughly the size of a human torso, painted white against a brown hillside so spectators could track the impact. At that distance, the bullet would travel for nearly 2 seconds before arriving. Every variable mattered. Every calculation had to be perfect. Vance settled into his position with practiced efficiency. His spotter, a young corporal with a tablet displaying ballistic data, began calling numbers in a low monotone. Wind speed 4.7 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature 87 degrees. Humidity 23%. Coriolis adjustment 0.03. Recommended hold 2.7 minutes right, 14.2 minutes up. The numbers meant nothing to Elijah. Not because he did not understand them, but because they were wrong. He could see the wind flags along the range, could read the patterns they created, and he knew that the tablet calculations were based on measurements taken at ground level. The wind at 800 meters was different. The wind at 1,200 meters was different still. The thermal column rising from a rocky outcropping at 1,100 meters would push the bullet left before the crosswind at 1,400 meters pushed it back right. The tablet did not know about the thermal column. The spotter did not know to look for it. Vance would miss. Perhaps not by much, but he would miss. Elijah said nothing. It was not his place to speak. He was invisible, a vagrant allowed to watch only for the general's amusement, and no one would believe him anyway. Vance took a breath, let a half out. His finger found the trigger. The rifle cracked. The crowd held its breath. 2 seconds later, the bullet struck the hillside approximately 8 inches left of the target, kicking up a puff of dust that was visible even from the grandstands. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Vance's spotter stared at his tablet in confusion, checking and rechecking the numbers that had promised success. The young champion remained motionless in his position for a long moment, his jaw tight with controlled frustration. He took 3 more shots over the next 10 minutes. The second struck 6 inches low. The third hit the edge of the target, but did not knock it down. The fourth finally connected with enough force to topple the silhouette, but the record required 3 consecutive hits, and Vance had only achieved 1. The crowd applauded politely. General Whitmore's expression flickered with disappointment before resettling into its default mask of superiority. The record would not fall today, but the event could still be salvaged. There was still the matter of the vagrant and his rusty rifle. "Bring him over," Whitmore said to his aide, loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. "Let us see what our homeless friend can do with a real firing line." Elijah felt the approach of the security officers before he saw them. 2 young Marines, neither of them old enough to remember a world before smartphones, flanking him with expressions that mixed embarrassment with duty. "Sir," one of them said, and the word carried none of the respect it should have. "The general would like you to take a shot for the demonstration." Elijah looked at the young Marine, then passed him to where Whitmore stood waiting with theatrical patience. The crowd in the grandstands had turned to watch, their murmurs carrying across the range like the buzz of distant insects. He should refuse. He should simply shake his head, collect his rifle case, and walk away from this place and these people who saw nothing when they looked at him. He had survived 30 years by refusing, by keeping the promise, by letting Patience sleep in her case and letting Thaddeus rest in his memory. But the security officer's hand closed around his arm to guide him toward the firing line, and as it did, the old man's sleeve rode up. The young Marine froze. On Elijah's forearm, faded by decades of sun and neglect, but still legible, a tattoo emerged from beneath the fabric. Crosshairs superimposed over a globe. Coordinates in small, precise numbers. 17.483, 3 degrees north, 106.6000 degrees east. And beneath them, in letters that had once been crisp and were now soft with age, the initials TB. The security officer released his grip as if he had been burned. His partner leaned in to see what had caused a reaction, and his face went pale as well. Near the rangemaster's station, Okonkwo saw the exchange. He saw the young Marines step backward, saw their expressions shift from dismissal to uncertainty to something approaching fear. He was too far away to see the tattoo itself, but he did not need to see it. He already knew those coordinates. He had memorized them as a student at Quantico, had studied them as part of the historical record of operations that officially never happened. They marked a village in Laos where, in 1969, a single sniper had eliminated an entire command structure from a distance that should have been impossible. The operation had no name. The sniper had no face, but he had a call sign. Elijah pulled his sleeve down slowly, covering the tattoo, covering the past. He looked at the two security officers with eyes that held no anger and no accusation, only the infinite patience of a man who had learned to wait for hours without moving, for days without speaking, for 30 years without shooting. "I will take the shot," he said quietly, "if that is what the general requires." And he began to walk toward the firing line, the rifle case hanging from his shoulder, the weight of 3 decades pressing down on every step. The walk from the equipment tent to the firing line was perhaps 60 meters. Elijah covered the distance in steps that seemed to take hours, each footfall carrying him closer to a line he had sworn never to cross again. The crowd watched in curious silence. Most of them had already dismissed him as a source of entertainment, a punchline waiting to be delivered. They saw the patched jacket and the ruined boots and the battered case. And they saw exactly what General Whitmore wanted them to see. A vagrant, a pretender, a cautionary tale about what happened to men who claimed credentials they had not earned. But scattered among the spectators, a few faces had begun to shift. The two security officers who had seen the tattoo stood near the grandstands, speaking in urgent whispers that drew the attention of those around them. A retired gunnery sergeant in the third row leaned forward with narrowed eyes, studying the old man's gait with sudden intensity. A young lieutenant who had written her thesis on unconventional warfare in Southeast Asia felt her breath catch as fragments of research clicked into place. Something was happening. They could not yet say what, but the atmosphere had begun to change. Elijah reached the firing line and stopped. General Whitmore stood nearby with his arms crossed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Vance had risen from his position and stood watching with an expression that mixed contempt with something less certain. The camera crews had adjusted their angles to capture what everyone assumed would be a humiliating failure. "Well," Whitmore said, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet, "here we are. Our guest has agreed to show us what he can do." He gestured toward the 800-meter target, the beginner's distance, the one used for qualification rather than competition. "Let us start with something simple, shall we? I would hate for you to embarrass yourself on the longer ranges." Elijah did not respond to the general. His eyes had moved past the 800-meter target, past the 1,000 and the 1,200 and the 1,500 where Vance had failed. They had fixed on the golden silhouette at 2 miles, the trophy target that existed only as a symbol of what might someday be achieved. "That one," he said quietly. Whitmore's smile faltered. Vance made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. Somewhere in the grandstands, someone whispered, "What did he say?" And the question rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. "The 2-meal target," Elijah repeated. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "If I'm going to shoot, I would like to shoot at that one." For a long moment, no one spoke. The request was so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality, that it did not seem to require a response. The 2-meal target had never been hit in competition history. Professional shooters with million-dollar equipment and teams of spotters had attempted it as a publicity stunt and failed. The idea that a homeless man with a rusted rifle could succeed where champions had not even come close was beyond ridiculous. It was impossible. General Whitmore recovered first. His smile returned, wider than before, sharp with anticipation. "By all means," he said. "By all means, let us watch you attempt the impossible. This should be memorable." He gestured for his aide to make the necessary arrangements. Word spread through the crowd with electric speed. The vagrant was going to try for 2 miles. Cameras that had been pointed at the standard targets swung toward the distant golden silhouette. Spectators who had been preparing to leave settled back into their seats. Even Vance, who had been ready to dismiss the entire spectacle, found himself moving closer to watch. Elijah knelt in the dust of the firing position and laid his case flat before him. The latches clicked open. Patience waited inside, patient as her name, unchanged by the decades that had passed since her last shot. He lifted the rifle and felt her weight settle into his hands. The rust on her barrel caught the afternoon light, orange against steel, and he knew that everyone watching was already laughing inside. They saw decay. They saw neglect. They saw a man who had given up on himself, trying to reclaim something that no longer existed. They did not see the hand-lapped barrel beneath the corrosion. They did not see the custom action or the trigger that broke at exactly 2.3 pounds. They did not see the thousands of hours and hundreds of shots that had made this rifle an extension of its shooter's will. And they did not see what came next. Elijah reached into the case and lifted the scope from its felt-lined compartment. The initials TB caught the light. His fingers trembled slightly as he brought it to the rifle's empty mounts, trembled with something that was not age or weakness, but the weight of 30 years pressing against this single moment. "I know I promised," he whispered, so quietly that no one could hear. "I know I said never again." He slid the scope into position. The mounts accepted it as if they had been waiting, as if patience had been holding her breath for 3 decades and could finally exhale. "But you told me to take shots for both of us. And this one, Thaddeus, this one is for you." The scope locked into place with a click that seemed to echo across the range. And 50 meters away, Master Gunnery Sergeant Okonkwo began to walk forward. He did not know why. He did not know what he expected to see. He only knew that he needed to be closer, needed to witness whatever was about to happen, because something in his bones was telling him that he was about to watch history. The legend was about to shoot. The firing line had become a stage, and every eye in Camp Pendleton was fixed upon it. Elijah lowered himself into a prone position with a fluidity that made several observers catch their breath. There was no stiffness in the movement, no hesitation, no sign of the age that had seemed so apparent when he stood hunched in his patched jacket. He flowed onto the ground like water, finding its level, his body remembering positions it had held for hours and days in jungles and deserts half a world away. Vance watched from 10 meters to the left, his arms crossed, his expression locked in studied skepticism. But his eyes betrayed him. They moved across the old man's form with the involuntary assessment of a professional, noting the placement of elbows and the angle of spine and the way the rifle seemed to become part of the shooter rather than something separate. The position was perfect. Textbook. No, better than textbook. It was the position that textbooks had been written to describe. General Whitmore stood near the observation platform, close enough to be in frame when the cameras captured the inevitable failure. His aide held a tablet ready to record the moment for the general's social media accounts, already composing captions about humoring the less fortunate and lessons in knowing one's limitations. On the grandstands, Corporal Yuki Tanaka had abandoned her official position with the media crew. She stood at the railing with her personal phone raised, something in her gut telling her that whatever happened next would be worth capturing. The official cameras would get clean footage from professional angles. Her phone would get the truth. Elijah pressed his eye to the scope, and the world fell away. Through Thaddeus's glass, the golden target at 2 miles leapt into focus. It was smaller than a dinner plate at this distance, a speck of reflected light against the brown hillside. The mirage between here and there created layers of distortion, heat rising from rocks and brush and bare earth and columns and currents that would push a bullet off course in a dozen different directions. A modern shooter would have consulted a ballistic computer, would have deployed wind meters at multiple distances, would have had a spotter calling numbers from a tablet connected to weather stations along the range, would have spent 30 minutes calculating variables before ever touching the trigger. Elijah had none of those things. He had his eyes. He had his memory. He had the formulas that Thaddeus had written in notebooks that no longer existed, preserved perfectly in a mind that had never allowed itself to forget. And he had time. Not much, but enough. His fingers began their rhythm against the rifle stock, tapping calculations that only he could hear. Distance 3,520 yards. Temperature 87 degrees at ground level, dropping approximately 3 degrees per 1,000 feet of altitude. Humidity 23%. Barometric pressure somewhere around 29.92 inches, judging by the way sound carried across the range. Coriolis effect at this latitude would push the bullet right by approximately 4 inches over this distance. Spin drift from the barrel's twist rate would push it further right, perhaps another 7 inches. The mirage told him about wind. Not just wind at ground level, but wind at 500 yards where the flags showed a crosswind from the southwest. Wind at 1,000 yards where the heat shimmer bent slightly differently, suggesting the crosswind had weakened. Wind at 1,500 yards where a thermal column rose from that rocky outcropping Vance had not accounted for. Wind at 2,000 yards where the terrain channeled airflow in ways that instruments could not measure, but eyes could see. He saw all of it, processed all of it, synthesized it into a single point of aim that existed nowhere on the graduated markings of a scope, a point that only made sense if you understood that ballistics was not science but art, not calculation but intuition trained by 10,000 repetitions until it became instinct. The bullet would drop over 400 inches from the moment it left the barrel to the moment it arrived at the target. It would travel for more than 4 seconds through air that was trying to push it off course with every foot of flight. It would slow from supersonic to subsonic, transitioning through a turbulent barrier that could destabilize even the most precisely manufactured round. 100 things could go wrong. 1,000 things could go wrong. But Elijah had made the shot before. Different distance, different target, different stakes. In a jungle in Laos in 1969, with Thaddeus whispering numbers in his ear and a high-value target walking through a village that officially did not exist. He had lain in a hide site for 3 days waiting for that shot, had calculated and recalculated until the numbers were carved into his soul, had pulled the trigger and watched through his scope as the impossible became possible. That shot had made him a legend. This shot would remind the world that legends do not die. They simply wait. Elijah's breathing shifted into the rhythm that Thaddeus had taught him 40 years ago. For counts in. Hold. For counts out. His heartbeat slowed to match, each beat creating a window of perfect stillness between pulses. His finger found the trigger. 2.3 pounds of pressure separated him from everything he had promised to leave behind. Behind him, Okonkwo had stopped walking. He stood frozen, perhaps 20 meters away, close enough to see the old man's breathing pattern, close enough to recognize it from training he had received decades ago. His hands had begun to shake. That rhythm, that specific rhythm, it was not in any manual. It was not taught at any school. It was passed down only from one shooter to another, a secret technique developed by Ghost and shared only with those he deemed worthy. Okonkwo had learned it from an instructor who had learned it from another instructor who had learned it from someone who refused to give his name, someone they called Spectre. The range fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elijah's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot, one chance, one conversation with a dead man that had waited 30 years to be finished. Take it for both of us, Eli. I am, brother. I am. 17 seconds passed with Elijah's finger on the trigger. To the spectators in the grandstands, the delay seemed interminable. Whispers began to circulate. He has frozen. He does not know what he is doing. Someone should stop this before it becomes even more embarrassing. General Whitmore's smile widened with each passing moment, his confidence growing that the old man had finally realized the impossibility of what he had attempted. But Elijah was not frozen. He was waiting. The wind at 1,800 yards was shifting. He could see it in the way the mirage bent, a subtle change in the thermal patterns that told him a gust was building, gathering strength as it moved down the canyon toward the range. In 4 seconds, it would reach the 1,200-yard mark. In 7 seconds, it would hit 800 yards. In 12 seconds, it would arrive at his position. But by then it would not matter because the bullet would already be 2 miles downrange. He was timing the shot to thread the needle between wind patterns that no instrument had measured because no instrument could measure them. He was reading the future of the air itself, predicting where stillness would exist for the fraction of a second his bullet needed to pass through each zone undisturbed. Thaddeus had called it riding the river. You do not fight the current, he had explained in a hide site in the Central Highlands, his voice barely a whisper against Elijah's ear. You find the places where the current is going where you need to go, and you let it carry you. Elijah had not understood at first. He had been 17 years old, trained in the mechanics of shooting but ignorant of its art. Thaddeus had spent 3 years teaching him to see what others could not, to feel the rhythm of the environment, and synchronize his breathing and his heartbeat and his trigger pull with the invisible forces that govern the flight of a bullet. By the time Elijah understood, he had become the best shooter in the Marine Corps. By the time Thaddeus died, he had become something more, something that scared the officers who read his after-action reports and prompted the intelligence agencies to classify operations that should have been celebrated. Spectre, the ghost who made impossible shots and then vanished before anyone could confirm he had been there at all. Now, 30 years later, the ghost was aiming at a target that the modern Marine Corps considered symbolic rather than achievable. 14 seconds. The gust reached 1,200 yards. Elijah saw the mirage shift, saw the thermal patterns bend and recover. The window was approaching. 15 seconds. General Whitmore turned to his aide and muttered something about getting this over with. Perhaps we should just escort him off the range before he wastes any more of our time. 16 seconds. Okonkwo took an involuntary step forward. His lips had begun to form a word, a name, a call sign that he had only ever heard spoken in reverent whispers by instructors who treated it like a prayer. 17 seconds. The window opened. A corridor of relative stillness extending from the firing line to the 2-meal target. A path through the chaos of wind and thermal currents that would exist for perhaps 2 seconds before collapsing back into turbulence. Elijah exhaled half a breath and held it. His heart completed a beat and paused between pulses. His finger added the final fraction of an ounce to the 2.3 pounds already pressing against the trigger. Patience spoke. The crack of the rifle split the silence like thunder, echoing off the brown hills and rolling across the range in waves that seemed to carry physical weight. Elijah did not move. His eye remained pressed to the scope, tracking the path his bullet would take even though the projectile was traveling far too fast to see. 1 second. The bullet crossed the 800-yard line, still supersonic, still stable, riding the corridor he had predicted. 2 seconds. The bullet passed 1,600 yards, beginning to slow, beginning to drop, the 400-inch arc of its trajectory bending it toward the earth with patient inevitability. 3 seconds. The bullet crossed into the zone where the thermal column rose from the rocky outcropping. the same column that had pushed Vance's shot off target. But Elijah had accounted for it. He had aimed where the bullet needed to be after the push, not before. For seconds, the bullet approached the target, subsonic now, its flight stabilized by the precise twist rate of Patience's hand-lapped barrel, its path corrected by calculations that existed only in the mind of a man everyone had dismissed as worthless. 4.5 seconds. The golden target rang like a bell. For a moment, no one moved. The sound was so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything the spectators had been told to believe, that their minds refused to process it. They had seen the homeless man take a shot. They had waited for the inevitable miss. And instead, they had heard the unmistakable song of steel striking steel at 2 miles. Then the target fell. The golden silhouette that no one had ever hit, the trophy that existed only to represent an impossible dream, toppled backward off its stand and disappeared into the brush. Elijah lifted his eye from the scope. His expression had not changed. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction, no pride. There was only the profound exhaustion of a man who had just broken a 30-year promise and did not know whether to feel liberated or damned. He whispered 3 words that no one else could hear. "Still got it, brother." And then the silence shattered into chaos. The grandstands erupted in a confusion of voices and movement. People rose from their seats, pointing toward the distant hillside where the golden target had stood moments before. Camera operators swung their equipment wildly, trying to capture reactions while simultaneously confirming what their own eyes had witnessed. The official competition announcer fumbled with his microphone, starting and stopping sentences that never quite formed into coherent words. General Whitmore stood frozen near the observation platform, his carefully constructed expression of superiority crumbling like a sand castle meeting the tide. His mouth opened and closed without sound. His aide stared at the tablet in his hands, as if the device had personally betrayed him. On the firing line, Elijah remained prone behind Patience, his breathing slowly returning to normal rhythm. He did not acknowledge the chaos erupting around him. He simply lay there, his cheek resting against the worn stock of his rifle, his eye no longer pressed to the scope, but gazing at nothing in particular. It was done. After 30 years, it was done, and he did not know what to feel. Staff Sergeant Declan Vance was the first to move toward him. The young champion walked with hesitant steps, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He stopped 3 meters from the old man and stared down at the rusted rifle, at the prone form that had not moved since taking the shot, at the scope bearing initials he could not read from this angle. "That is impossible," Vance said. His voice cracked on the second word. "I have studied this range for 4 years. I know every wind pattern, every thermal current, every variable that affects a shot. What you just did is not possible." Elijah did not respond. He was listening to a different voice, one that existed only in his memory, one that was laughing with the particular joy that Thaddeus had only shown when mathematics became art. "You crazy son of a gun," the memory said. "You actually did it. You rode the river all the way home." Master Gunnery Sergeant Okonkwo pushed through the gathering crowd, his legs carrying him forward despite the trembling that had seized his entire body. He reached Vance's position and stopped, looking down at the old man with eyes that glistened with something between recognition and disbelief. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper, rough with emotion that 32 years of service had not prepared him to contain. "What is your name, Marine?" Elijah finally moved. Slowly, with the care of a man handling something fragile, he lifted himself from the prone position. He gathered Patience in his arms and rose to his feet, joints protesting after the prolonged stillness. When he turned to face Okonkwo, his pale eyes held the same quiet patience they had shown all day. "Kowalczyk," he said softly. "Gunnery Sergeant Elijah Kowalczyk. Retired." Okonkwo's knees buckled. He caught himself on Vance's shoulder, gripping the younger man's arm to stay upright. His free hand rose to his face, pressing against his mouth as if to hold back a sound that wanted desperately to escape. "And your call sign?" Okonkwo managed. His voice broke completely. What was your call sign, Gunnery Sergeant? The crowd had gone silent again. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for the answer that would change everything. Elijah looked at Okonkwo for a long moment. He saw the recognition in the man's eyes, saw the tears beginning to track down weathered cheeks, saw the trembling that spoke of decades of stories suddenly becoming real. "Spectre," he said. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread outward in waves of shock and revelation. Okonkwo's legs gave out entirely. He dropped to his knees in the dust of the firing line, his hands still pressed to his mouth, his shoulders beginning to shake with sobs he could not control. Around him, the crowd's murmur rose to a roar of confused questions and frantic explanations. Someone was calling for verification. Someone else was demanding to see service records. General Whitmore was shouting something about hoaxes and stolen valor, his voice increasingly desperate as the narrative he had constructed collapsed around him. But cutting through all of it, clear as a rifle shot, came a voice from the VIP section of the grandstands. "Eli." The voice was old but strong, carrying across the range with the authority of a man who had once commanded thousands. "Eli Kowalczyk, is that you?" The crowd parted as a wheelchair was pushed forward by a young aide in dress uniform. The man in the chair was ancient, his body withered by age and illness, but his eyes were sharp and his jaw was set with fierce determination. Lieutenant General Marcus Ashworth, retired, former commanding officer of the Scout Sniper School. The man who had written Elijah's first commendation letter in 1971 and his last in 1991. The man who had personally carried Thaddeus Birch's flag-draped coffin alongside Elijah at a funeral that was never officially recorded. "Sir," Elijah said, and the word carried every ounce of respect it had ever been meant to hold. His spine straightened, his shoulders squared. For the first time all day, the soldier beneath the vagrant became visible to everyone. Ashworth's eyes moved to the rifle in Elijah's arms, to the scope mounted on top, to the initials that caught the afternoon light. "Is that Thaddeus's scope?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir." Elijah's voice wavered for the first time. "First time I have mounted it in 30 years. Ashworth was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to his aide with an expression that could have cut steel. "Give me General Whitmore," he said. "Now. And somebody find this man a chair and a glass of water. Then I want every camera on this range pointed at me while I explain to the United States Marine Corps exactly who they have been mocking for the past 4 hours." Lieutenant General Ashworth's wheelchair came to rest at the center of the firing line, and the chaos around him subsided into uneasy silence. Camera crews jostled for position. Spectators pressed against the barriers. Even General Whitmore, still pale and stammering, had been brought forward by his aides to stand within earshot of whatever was about to happen. Elijah had been given a folding chair and a bottle of water, both of which he accepted with quiet thanks. He sat with Patience across his lap, his weathered hands resting on her stock, his eyes fixed on the ground before him. He looked like a man waiting for judgment rather than vindication. Ashworth studied him for a long moment, his ancient eyes softening with something that might have been grief or pride or both. Then he turned to face the cameras, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 50 years of service. "My name is Lieutenant General Marcus Ashworth, United States Marine Corps, retired. I commanded the Scout Sniper School at Quantico from 1985 to 1993. Before that, I served 3 tours in Vietnam and 2 in operations that still do not officially exist. I have trained and commanded some of the finest precision shooters this nation has ever produced." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "The man sitting before you is Gunnery Sergeant Elijah Kowalczyk, call sign Spectre. He is not a vagrant pretending to be a veteran. He is the most decorated scout sniper in Marine Corps history, with a service record that remains classified because the operations he participated in remain classified. He has received the Silver Star twice, the Bronze Star with Valor Device 3 times, and the Purple Heart on 4 separate occasions. He has made confirmed kills at distances that were considered impossible for his era, using equipment that your modern shooters would consider primitive. Ashworth's voice hardened as his gaze found General Whitmore. And for the past 4 hours, he has been mocked and humiliated by personnel under your command, General. Personnel who judged him by his appearance rather than his bearing. Personnel who demanded he prove credentials that should have been obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, but Ashworth cut him off with a gesture that carried the force of a direct order. I'm not finished. The man beside Gunnery Sergeant Kowalczyk in every operation was Corporal Thaddeus Birch, his spotter, his brother in all but blood. Corporal Birch wrote the appendix on extreme long-range calculation that is still used in every scout sniper training program today. He developed the mathematical models that your ballistic computers are based on. And in February of 1991, during an operation in Kuwait that you will never read about, he gave his life pushing Gunnery Sergeant Kowalczyk out of an explosion that would have killed them both. Ashworth's voice cracked slightly, and he paused to compose himself. I carried that man's coffin. I stood beside Elijah at a funeral that was never recorded because the mission was never acknowledged. And I watched one of the finest Marines I have ever known walk away from everything because the weight of his grief was more than any human being should have to carry. The crowd was absolutely silent. Corporal Tanaka's phone trembled in her hands as she recorded, tears streaming down her face. Okonkwo remained on his knees, his head bowed, his shoulders still shaking. Vance stood frozen, his expression cycling through shame and disbelief and something that looked like the first stirrings of genuine remorse. Elijah finally raised his eyes. He looked at Ashworth with an expression that held 30 years of pain and isolation, 30 years of grief that had never been properly mourned, 30 years of running from the memory of a man who had died, saying it was not his fault. I failed him, Elijah said softly. The words were not meant for the cameras, but the microphones caught them anyway. I missed the shooter by half a second. Thaddeus saw him before I did. He pushed me clear and took the blast himself. 90 seconds. That is how long he lived after the shrapnel hit. 90 seconds of trying to breathe with lungs full of blood while I held him and told him help was coming. His voice broke, and for the first time all day, the mask of patience cracked. He told me it was not my fault. With his last breath, he told me to keep shooting, to take shots for both of us. And I cannot do it. I cannot pick up a rifle knowing he would never call a win for me again. So I stopped. I walked away. I became no one because that was easier than being the man who let his brother die. Ashworth wheeled himself closer and reached out a trembling hand to rest on Elijah's shoulder. You did not let him die, Eli. War took him. The same war that took so many of our brothers. And punishing yourself for 30 years does not honor his memory. Living does. Shooting does. Being the man he believed in does. Elijah looked at the hand on his shoulder, then at the face of the man who had commanded him through some of the darkest years of his life. Something in his expression shifted, softened, began to release a weight that had been crushing him for 3 decades. He told me to ride the river, Elijah whispered. Right before he died. He said I still had shots to take. Ashworth nodded, his own eyes glistening. Then take them, Eli. Take them for both of you. That is what he would have wanted. That is what he died believing you would do. In the grandstands, someone began to clap. A single pair of hands, slow and deliberate. Then another joined. Then another. Within moments, the applause had swelled into a thunderous ovation that rolled across the range like a wave, carrying with it the weight of recognition and respect and the collective shame of everyone who had looked at Elijah Kowalczyk and seen only a vagrant. Whitmore stood motionless in the midst of it, his career crumbling around him, his face the color of ash. No one was looking at him anymore. No one cared about his carefully staged photo opportunities or his social media presence or his political ambitions. They were looking at the legend who had just reminded them what it meant to be a Marine. 3 weeks after the shot heard around the Marine Corps, Elijah Kowalczyk stood at a window overlooking the brown hills of Camp Pendleton. The apartment behind him was small but clean, provided by the Scout Sniper Association in a building reserved for veterans transitioning back into stable housing. It had a bed with sheets that smelled like lavender. It had a bathroom with hot water that never ran out. It had a refrigerator stocked with food that he did not have to ration or hide. It had walls and a door that locked, and silence that was not filled with the sounds of traffic or weather or the footsteps of people who wished he would disappear. He was not certain he deserved any of it, but he was learning to accept it anyway. On the shelf beside the window, Thaddeus's scope rested in a pool of morning light. Elijah had removed it from Patience after that day on the range, had cleaned it with care he had not shown anything in 30 years, and had placed it where the sun would touch it every morning. It was not a shrine. It was a conversation, a way of saying I'm still here, brother, without having to speak the words aloud. Patience hung on the wall nearby, cleaned but never polished. The rust remained. Elijah had decided to leave it there, a reminder that appearances meant nothing and that decay on the surface did not mean decay within. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He crossed the small apartment and opened it to find Master Gunnery Sergeant Okonkwo standing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that had become familiar over the past 3 weeks. It was the expression of a man who still could not quite believe he was standing in the presence of a legend. "Morning, Gunnery Sergeant," Okonkwo said. "Brought you the good stuff from the officer's mess. Figured you earned it." Elijah accepted the coffee with a small nod of thanks and stepped aside to let Okonkwo enter. They had developed a routine, these two. Okonkwo would visit every few days, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with news, always with questions that Elijah answered when he could and deflected when he could not. The young man who had mocked him on the firing line had been the most surprising visitor of all. Staff Sergeant Declan Vance had appeared at Elijah's door 4 days after the competition, his face pale and his hands trembling as he struggled to find words for an apology that seemed inadequate to the offense. Elijah had listened in silence, then invited him inside and spent 3 hours explaining the thermal column that had cost him the 500-meter record. Vance had returned twice since then, notebook in hand, hungry for knowledge that no training program could provide. He had also begun volunteering at a veteran transition center in Oceanside, working with homeless Marines who reminded him uncomfortably of the man he had almost dismissed as worthless. Redemption, Elijah had learned, often began with humiliation. He did not begrudge the young champion his journey. The video, Okonkwo said, settling into the apartment's single armchair. It crossed 50 million views last night. Corporal Tanaka has been interviewed by every major network. She is handling it well, considering. Elijah sipped his coffee and said nothing. The video was a strange thing to contemplate. 50 million people had watched him take a shot that he had intended for an audience of 1. 50 million strangers had witnessed his grief and his guilt and his moment of breaking a promise he had kept for 30 years. He was not certain how he felt about that, but Thaddeus would have laughed about it, would have called him famous and made jokes about autograph seekers, and that thought made the strangeness easier to bear. "There is something else," Okonkwo continued. His voice had shifted, carrying a weight that made Elijah look up from his coffee. "General Whitmore resigned yesterday, officially for personal reasons, but everyone knows the truth. The commandant made it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. There will be a formal review of how veterans are treated at official events." Elijah nodded slowly. He felt no satisfaction at Whitmore's fall. The man had been cruel, yes, but cruelty often came from ignorance rather than malice. Perhaps losing everything would teach him what kindness could not. "And there's one more thing," Okonkwo said. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope bearing the seal of the Scout Sniper School. "They want to name the Tumio Range after you. The Kowalczyk Range. Permanent recognition of the shot and the shooter." Elijah looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Name it after Thaddeus," he said quietly. "The Birch Range. He was the one who taught me to see. He was the one who made every shot possible. I just pulled the trigger." Okonkwo's eyes glistened, but he nodded and tucked the envelope away. "I will make sure they understand." They sat in comfortable silence as the morning light strengthened outside the window. Somewhere on the hills below, young snipers were beginning their training for the day, learning calculations that Thaddeus had written and techniques that Elijah had perfected. They would never know the full story of the men whose work they were inheriting, but they would carry that legacy forward one shot at a time. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in forms we do not expect, please consider subscribing to this channel and share in the comments below. Who is the quiet legend in your life that deserves recognition? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform. Sometimes they are the ones we overlook, the ones we dismiss, the ones whose stories we never think to ask. Thank you for watching, and remember, every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Elijah set down his coffee and walked to the window. He looked out at the hills where he had made the impossible shot, where he had broken a promise and found absolution, where he had finally stopped running from the memory of a man who had never blamed him for anything. "Still here, brother," he said softly, "still taking shots for both of us." And somewhere in his memory, Thaddeus Birch smiled and whispered back, "I know, Eli. I always knew you would."